Restoration Artifacts presents fascinating items made and used by people over the span of 2 centuries involved in the restoration. While these artifacts are remarkable, it is the stories of the people behind them that really capture our hearts. Each one of these people lived lives full of challenges, obstacles, and risks of their future. And they faced those challenges with courage, faith, and perseverance. We know this because of the stories left in their journals, handed down generation to generation for our benefit. Their stories have become precious artifacts that give us hope today. Now, we participate in the ongoing restoration. Every day we live, we are creating history, even changing it by our decisions. We can choose to live our lives to honor those whose sacrifice benefits us and helps us to this day. Remember that your today will become history looked back upon by people in the future who care about you. Leave them your stories, a continuing source of hope.
Shalom, I'm Daniel Rona from Jerusalem and Salt Lake City. Being a born in Israel member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, my Jewish heritage helps me understand the restoration as a significant family event. My wife, Marilyn, and I serve as service missionaries in the church history department, writing histories of the church in different countries. Presently, we're compiling the marvelous events of the church in Israel. The restoration of the gospel is a very meaningful part of my Jewish expectation. One of the most captivating celebrations for religious and non-religious Jews is Passover, continuing every year for 3,400 years, Jews celebrating the restoration of their nation as they were delivered from Egypt. At this Passover meal, the U-shaped seating arrangement is open towards Jerusalem. The first seat is the youngest male, and the second seat is the father or grandfather. The rest is filled up with family members. However, the last seat on the other end is a decorative seat for a guest, Elijah the prophet, who is expected to come unexpectedly. Elijah came to Joseph Smith in Kirtland, Ohio, on April 3rd, 1836. Not so coincidentally, that was Passover week in 1836. And while millions of Jews were setting a place for Elijah, opening doors, he came to the prophet Joseph Smith to restore the priesthood keys to seal families together forever in, of all places, Kirtland, Ohio. To the Jews, this doesn't sound very Jewish. However, it is true. You know, Passover is a wonderful time of binding the old and the young. In case Elijah might arrive at your home, you send the children to open the doors and the windows. One Passover night in Israel, we had invited my mother, Kitty, her late second husband, Tzvi Tohar, the founder of Israel's military and civilian flight schools, the pilot who flew Adolf Eichmann out of Argentina, died, leaving no man in the house. Once we moved back to Israel, Grandma Kitty came to our home in Jerusalem, somewhat expecting and amused at a Latter-day Saint perspective of our Passover meal due to my conversion. It was time to open the doors and the windows, so I said to my youngest son, "Josh, open the doors." 7 years old, he said, "I won't do it." Urging him, I said, "So Elijah can come." Arms folded, he said, "He's already been here." He knew Elijah came to Joseph Smith in Kirtland, Ohio, on April 3rd, 1836. Not so coincidentally, that was Passover week in 1836.
The Kirtland Temple was designed totally differently. They held meetings there, but it was there so that they could receive the keys that were needed to set the church up and get the other ordinances going. And the Nauvoo Temple was for the ordinances.
This is the same Elijah who was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire and came to the Mount of Transfiguration with Moses to the Savior, Peter, James, and John. A bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice out of the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him." Elijah restored priesthood keys to Peter, James, and John. It is noteworthy that Elijah's mission includes turning the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers. So, at the Passover meal, the seating arrangement is symbolic. Seated opposite Elijah are the youngest and the oldest. I remember my first visit to the Kirtland Temple years ago. As a Jew, I was overcome with joyful tears. I was in the room where Elijah appeared. Elijah's appearance at Passover, 1836, an astronomer calculated that Elijah's appearance in 1836 was precisely on an Easter Sunday, the third day of Passover, the only time those 2 days coincided since the date of the Savior's resurrection. In a very real sense, because of this restoration of priesthood keys, every temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a restoration artifact. As President Nelson expressed, the restoration is ongoing. The day will come when the temple in Jerusalem will also be restored. For thousands of years, observant Jews continue to pray at the beginning and ending of every meal for the restoration of the temple. No one prays more for the restoration of the temple than the Jews.
Years ago, a visitor to Salt Lake City was Baron Rothschild, the financial founder of Israel. His guide in Salt Lake was the prophet John Taylor. John Taylor asked him, "Rothschild, do you know the verse where the Lord will suddenly come to his temple?" Rothschild turned and said, "Yes, is this the one?" And the prophet said, "No, you will build that one. We will have hundreds like this, but you will build that one." It's amazing how important temples are for the two Israelite nations. The ancient Israelites carried their temple covenant artifacts, their Ark of the Covenant as they journeyed to their promised land. The Latter-day Saints built a temporary temple and urgently began building another one as soon as they arrived at their promised land. Temples are part of the restoration of all things.
The artifacts, especially having them there and seeing them, you realize they're real, and the people that used them are real. So it does give you a much better appreciation, a good physical connection with the past.
The martyrdom of Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram. A lot of people know the basic story on how they went to Carthage and they were killed, but let's take it back 3 days to the time at about 3 or 4 in the afternoon when Joseph Smith was saying goodbye to his family for the last time. Then they made that long journey to Carthage, and they get there between 10 and 11 p.m., and a lot of people would assume that they were put in jail, but that didn't happen. No formal paperwork had been done. That wouldn't take place yet, and so they needed a place to stay, and they stayed at a place, the only place they could, called the Hamilton Inn, and there were only 2 rooms available, and Joseph and his entourage were 18 men. And so those 18 men divided up, and there were about 9 men in each room. And it's there that Joseph Smith had conversations that aren't too well known with some of the men that accompanied him.
The clothing that he wore was very interesting to me because, except for the front of the vest, everything was hand done. The pants were linen and wool, linsey woolsey, and they were homespun, home woven, hand sewn. It's hard to see in the display here the stitches on the shirt, the pants, even though the pants are thicker and rougher, and they are his work clothes, not his good clothes. The stitches on them are so tiny and so even, the buttonholes so beautiful.
But these men spent time with the prophet Joseph Smith, and that first night when they were in the inn, there was shooting outside, and it was a very fitful night, and the next day they're formally charged and taken to Carthage.
The day of the martyrdom, the jailer said, well, you guys should go into the jail. And they said, well, we wanted to have our meal first. And Willard Richards, after the meal, said he had a little upset stomach and sent Dan Jones out to get something to help settle his stomach. And when he came back, he was not allowed to come back into the jail. Joseph heard that he was down there, and he had written out a letter to Emma and some instruction to the saints to try to keep calm. And he went down there and gave Dan Jones this letter and says, well, take this to Nauvoo. The mob saw him, and they said, oh, he's calling the Nauvoo Legion out. And they tried to get it from Dan Jones, and Dan wouldn't give it to him. He hops on his horse and runs back to Nauvoo. He got it out of there. The mob started moving towards the jail. So they tried to lock the door because they knew the mob was coming, but the door would not lock. So in order to try to keep people out, they all got up against the door to hold it shut.
They had their shoulders up against the door. A shell came through and hit Hiram in the left side of his nose, which was a fatal shot. He fell backwards, exclaiming, I am a dead man.
But he lands in such a way that the blood comes out and soaks his right shoulder. In the meantime, John Taylor, who's trying to stop the mob, he gets shot several times, but not fatally. And he moves back away from the door, and Joseph realizes that if he doesn't do something, chances are that everybody in that room will be murdered.
And Joseph knew that he had to get out of there to save the lives of John Taylor and Willard Richards, so he ran to the window to jump out.
Climbs over this ledge, which is a big ledge, and jumps from the window, exclaiming, "Oh Lord, my God."
He was shot when he was at the window. He was shot when he came down.
People shooting from the door, they hit him, and from the outside. So he jumps out.
Laid him against the well, and they were going to cut off his head. But flashes of lightning and thunder came and scared them away.
And the mob, door's not open all the way, and they know there's some people in there that are still alive, but they don't want Joseph to get away. So they run back down to make sure that they can take care of Joseph. And of course they prop him up against the well and shoot him even more times. After that, they come back up to make sure that they can get rid of everybody else. But in the meantime, Willard Richards, he picks up John Taylor, who is severely injured, and he carries him into the cell next door and sticks him under the mattress, trying to hide him from the mob. While he's over there, the mob comes up the stairs again. The door's open now. They see Hiram laying on the floor there, and so they shoot at him. And realizing that nothing's going on in there, they go in to try to make sure that he's finished off. And he was hit several times. The only place he had blood was from that wound on his face, and it came down onto his shoulder.
They shot him in the knee. They turned him over and shot him in the back. We know the last shots were after he was dead because there was no blood from them. The shot that went into his nose, he did bleed profusely, and it went all over his right shoulder, so he had his head turned. The shot in the back went through his vest and his shirt and his pants, through his body, but it didn't come out because he had his watch in the pocket of his vest, and it hit the watch and shattered the face of it.
None of those holes in his body had any blood in it. He was already dead when they came back up and shot him again. and then they shot him through the back to make sure he's done. Now, meantime, here comes Samuel, and the mob is following him because they're chasing him, trying to stop him. But the people in Carthage think that the Nauvoo Legion now has arrived, and Samuel's leading them. So you hear, the Mormons are coming, and the mob quickly disperses. So the mob that was inside the jail, they hear this going on, and they don't have time now to find Willard Richards or John Taylor. So they run out and they leave, and that really, Samuel saved their lives, and it gave him the chance to help tend to John Taylor's wounds and prepare the bodies for taking them back to Nauvoo. However, in the process of all of this, he made his injuries even worse, so that just weeks later, he ends up passing as well. Interestingly enough, Joseph told about a dream that he had to W.W. Phelps just days before the martyrdom, where he had a dream that he and Hiram were walking along the water, and then later were joined by Samuel. So in a way, that he was foretelling that he and Hiram were together when they were died, and Samuel later joined them, and they were walking towards a heavenly city. So it kind of put everything together with that, and Samuel was actually another martyr, belated a little bit, but he still gave his life for what he did there.
Now, Willard Richards got help from the innkeeper, R. Toils Hamilton, to take the bodies back to the inn that evening of June 27th. And it's a 6-hour journey by wagon to Nauvoo, and so they decided to wait till the next day, and they needed proper coffins or boxes to take the bodies back. And R. Toils Hamilton had a sawmill, and so he made 2 coffins for the brothers. And the next morning, it was R. Toils Hamilton and Willard Richards who took the bodies back to Nauvoo. When the bodies arrive, this is when Emma faints, when she sees that her husband truly is dead. It's not just a rumor. But she also realizes that the boxes they were brought back in were not suitable to be the final resting place for the prophet and his brother, and so she ordered new coffins. During the days leading up to the funeral, there was word out that there was still an active bounty on Joseph Smith, dead or alive, and they didn't want the graves desecrated, digging up the bodies for somebody to try to collect this reward, and so they came up with the idea of burying the bodies below the Nauvoo house, using the coffins that were made by R. Toils Hamilton to use at the funeral, where W.W. Phelps gave a lengthy funeral sermon, and those coffins were filled with sandbags and rocks. Now, before that happened, though, Emma made an unusual request. She wanted a couple of the planks pulled off of her husband's coffin, and that was done. And after the funeral, she went to the town carpenter to have him cut those planks into strips. And we don't know exactly how many, but it was 12 to 16. And then they were run through a lathe and smoothed out. And then over the next several months, Emma gave those to the most loyal, trusted followers of Joseph Smith. And we know this because in August of 1844, just about 6 weeks after the martyrdom, Wilford Woodruff records in his journal, he said that I met with the prophet's widow, Emma Smith, and she gave me one of these pieces of wood which were turned into canes. And each person who received one did something unique with it. Like Willard Richards took his and painted it black and put an ivory top on it. When the prophet Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were on display for a viewing before the funeral, their faces were covered with glass. Part of that glass was taken, and it now covers the hair of the prophet Joseph Smith that is under the glass. Wilford Woodruff received one, and so did several others. And these were given out, and then the story tends to be forgotten until it picks up 13 years later in 1857, when Heber C. Kimball, the recipient of one of the canes, was at conference giving a speech, and halfway through he said, "I would now like to talk about sacred relics." Brothers and sisters, how much would you give for the staff of Abraham? Or how much would you give for a ring or a robe worn by the Savior? And he goes, "Well, I have something like that." And he holds up his cane and he says, "Brothers and sisters, I have in my hand a staff or a cane that is made from the blood-stained oak coffin of the prophet Joseph Smith. And so do others, Brother Brigham, Willard Richards, and others. And we all esteem it a great blessing to own one of these canes. And when I'm done with it, I will give it to my heir with instructions for him to care for it. And the day will come when it will be made known that multitudes will be healed by the touch of any of the canes. And the person who possesses the cane cannot be overcome by the power of the devil if he believes in the virtues thereof." And for me, that's one of the most spectacular artifacts of the Restoration, is a coffin cane. On the road to Carthage, Joseph Smith and Willard Richards had a conversation, and in part of that conversation, Willard Richards said something to the effect that, "Brother Joseph, if they're going to hang you, let them hang me instead." Now, this is a story that would have made its way back to the prophet's mother, Lucy Mack Smith, and she knew of the loyalty of Willard Richards to her son. And at some point after the martyrdom, she wanted to give something to Willard Richards to both remember the prophet and reward him for this loyalty to her son. And what she did is she gave something that had been used by all of the Smith brothers, these baby shoes, because a baby just doesn't wear out one set of shoes. But if you're a poor family, these get recycled and sewn, and this little memento would have, according to the family tradition of the people who had it, it was told to them that they were received by Lucy Mack Smith and passed down. And these stayed in the Willard Richards family up till about 30 years ago. 50, 60 years ago, there wasn't quite the attention, or let's say care taken with many church history sites. They weren't fully restored, and parts of these left and went into private hands. And one of those is this hearthstone from Sharon, Vermont. This is part of the hearthstone of the Joseph Smith Sr. family home, where Joseph Smith would have been born. And I think, since this is where Joseph would have learned to walk, I think it's a nice place to put his little shoes that he would have learned to walk in.